I don't know if I have to whisper. I don't know anymore. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to CASAA Live. I am Logan, VP of the board of CASAA, joined with Kristen, who is our member coordinator. I see a bunch of familiar faces in chat. It feels like I have been gone for a while. I feel like I haven't done this in what feels like, I don't know, like at least a month or a month and a half or something like that. It's good.
Yeah.
It's been a while. It's been a while. Philip out there in chat, John Fa of the Q Tube family, Patty, Tom, Adrian, RB, MKLL, RB Mickle, Chur is here. Chur. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have quite the episode ready for everybody. We're going to be joined later on by Miss Annie Kleykamp. Kleykamp? I think I hope I said that right. Who
Probably
is an
should have asked her.
experimental. What is that?
I said we probably should have asked her.
I
I guess
probably
when we
should have
had her
asked
on
her.
the
I'm just going to throw it out there and hope for the best. She's an experimental psychologist, scientist, and tobacco harm reduction advocate. And we are going to be talking about some correlational things and some causational things and the differences between them. But before we get into that, Kristen, would you like to get into some legislation?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. I hope you're ready because I'm going to do the thing.
I hope I'm ready to.
The whole world is on fire right now, Kristen. We have calls to action out all over the place, all over the place.
It is
So
crazy.
let's get right down to brass tacks and what do we
Yeah,
have
there's a
going on?
lot. And if you guys want to see all of these, they are at the top of the blog posts from this week. I've been just kind of keeping them all in there, and there's just this big list now. It's crazy. Alex, unfortunately, has some family emergency that he had to do this weekend, so that's why you're stuck with me. Sorry. Okay. The big one he said to talk about was New York. He wanted me to make the point that she's proposing to ban flavors in all tobacco and nicotine products that are still legally available, that this is not just a ban on menthol cigarettes, as some people seem to think. It's everything that's left over that you can still get. I mean, it is
Yeah,
cigarettes, but any
it's
flavors
everything.
in, nicotine pouches, snus, anything that could be flavored. There's also a tax hike she's proposing in all of these products. So if you're in New York and you're thinking, well, we already have a flavor ban, we still need you to fight these things. And if we can make the argument for these things, we can make the argument for vapor products too down the road. So
Yeah.
don't ignore that call to action, please, if you're in New York. And again, the
I've
links
done
are
it.
also
I'm
on
here
the.
in New York, and
Yeah, there
you
you go.
should too.
And the links are all also in the description of the video too. Minnesota SV2123 has a flavor ban. So again, on that one, Nebraska LB 84 has a vape tax. They're going from a
584.
584. What did I say?
LB 584. You just said LB 84.
Oh, yeah, 584. Sorry about that. It was proposed initially as a 5-cent tax per milliliter, and it sounds like rumor is that they might be changing that to a 20% wholesale tax. Cleveland, Ohio, there's a flavor ban that's in the works. Maryland, SB 259, a flavor ban. Oregon, HB 3090, a flavor ban. Connecticut, having Groundhog Day going here. Connecticut, HB 6488, a flavor ban. New Mexico, HB 94 is a flavor ban. Hawaii has two things going on. A HB 551 is a flavor ban, and HB 537 is a tax parity bill, meaning they want to redefine the products as tobacco products, and they don't. Everything's blank in there as how much the tax would be, but all tobacco products other than little cigars are taxed at 70% the retail cost. This is kind of pushed out to the year 3000, so there's not a huge rush on this.
Yeah, I don't remember if this came up in the last time you and I discussed legislation, or it might have been when it was Alex and I. A lot of people get kind of, I don't know, they get it in their heads that this bill doesn't happen until the year 3000 or something like that.
Yeah.
But when they do this, it's just to leave things open for debate. Like if they could just draw a little infinity loop in that date, they would, but they can't do that. They actually have to specify a date when this needs to be settled by. So they'll put some arbitrary future number just to leave it open for discussion for however long it needs to be debated or on the floor or whatever. And that way it doesn't die at a specified time. They can just be like, yeah, sure, we should be done talking about this by the year 3000.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
but that does not mean that we should just ignore it. Let's
get
involved in that debate, guys, and make sure you're letting your representatives and lawmakers know that you disagree with this. Yeah. There's 2 heads up. We don't have calls to action officially up for them yet, but Indiana HB 1133 has a flavor ban. This now has been assigned to the House Committee on Public Policy. And then Illinois SB 1561 has a public use ban. This one has been placed on the Senate calendar for the 3rd reading on March 21st, 2023. I know a lot of people think, oh, you just don't vape or you don't smoke. But that's what most people do. But the problem is all the things that they say to justify these laws. They lie about the risks of vaping. And so if they can argue that you can't vape outside unless you're outside 15 feet from a door, all these people who are walking by are like, see, they can't vape inside, so it must be dangerous. It must be as bad as smoking. It's just a bad look. And also, it's just another incentive they're taking away from people who smoke to switch.
Sure.
I mean, that was a huge thing for me. I've said this before. Back in 2009, Wisconsin was passing their indoor smoking ban, and it was a huge incentive for me to switch to vaping because of that. At the time, I was I went to bars a lot more back then.
You're right. I mean, it also
have it in Wisconsin, which is awesome. But businesses should be able to choose. There's literally no reason to make this a law, because there's no law against a business saying we don't want to allow it, and people have to do what. I mean, otherwise you're trespassing. So there are paths that businesses can take to avoid having people smoke or vaping in their businesses. So it's just ridiculous to have this a law, and it just puts bad optics on vaping as being as bad as smoking. So I see
it de-incentivizes people to switch, like you were saying. And then there's also just that kind of subliminal stigma that comes with it. When we force people outdoors, we force them away, we push them to the outskirts to because they're vaping, they're smoking, they're bad, they're dirty, they're polluting the air, whatever it is, regardless of a lack of scientific evidence there. It causes stigma for
and just think about it. I mean, I've seen some nursing homes now are rethinking their smoking bans, of people's last years of their life and having to leave the campus completely just to have a cigarette. I mean, just imagine, people have to, that increases your vulnerability. You're outside at 1 o'clock in the morning vaping because you can't be inside the bar. It's, now you're a target. I mean, it's just not. There's a lot of reasons not to.
And we can even look at things like Philadelphia's ban on smoking in treatment centers that they had going for I don't remember how many years. I'm almost 100% sure that that's been overturned since then. But we know that it caused higher dropout rates from treatment centers, lower intake rates. People didn't want to go if they weren't even allowed to go out and have a cigarette while they're dealing with withdrawals and treatment and trying to recover and all of these things. It really de-incentivized people seeking treatment for problematic drug use and whatnot. And it's just these smoking and vaping bans all over the place. It's just ridiculous, especially if it's outside. Especially outside, like in the open air.
Yeah.
Good Lord. You're going to smell what? Some strawberry donut? God forbid.
Right. And when I tweeted about it, immediately somebody responded to the tweet, well, you shouldn't vape where you can't smoke. And it's like, you're missing the point. You're really missing the point. It's so much more than that. It's like, you
can most of the places you should be able to smoke where you can't smoke.
Right? Exactly. Okay. Well, without further ado.
That does it for legislation. Just really quick, super fast recap. New York, Minnesota, Nebraska, Cleveland, Ohio, Maryland, Oregon, Connecticut, New Mexico, Hawaii with a few things and a couple of heads up going on in Indiana and Illinois. And again, Kristen, where can people find all of that?
You can find it in your state Facebook state pages. They're all posted there. It's on our blog at the top, and each state page on our website, CASAA.org. Just go over to what is it? Get involved tab. Scroll down to national and state, and there'll be a map there. You can click on that map, scroll down, and you can see any of the active calls to action that are going on.
Awesome. Fantastic. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of this here show. In just a second here, we're going to bring in Annie, who's a scientist and writer committed to removing the barriers that separate the public from health research and policy. She has a PhD in experimental psychology and with postdoctoral training at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She's the author of over 50 systematic reviews and publications in peer-reviewed academic journals. That's your LinkedIn, Annie. I hope you're ready to join us on the show. We're gonna bring her on. I could see her smiling. All right, let's do the thing. I hope that covered it. I hope that was accurate.
That was good. I haven't looked at that in a while, so it sounds all accurate, which I wrote it, so hopefully it is.
Yeah, I was saying there's only one person to blame if it's not accurate, right? Welcome, Annie. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I did just do that little kind of snippet about you, but really quick, if you want to just keep people kind of a background on you, what you do, how you finagled your way into this crazy space that we're all in right now with tobacco harm reduction and vaping and all of this stuff. The floor is yours, Annie.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll try to keep it short because I know my background's not the key, but to give you all some insight into sort of the expertise I'll bring today. So I grew up in Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, where you might imagine a lot of smoking. It's a big part of my family. Never truly clicked with me. I was, I always had some Marlboro ultralights or whatever in the 90s when I was going to college. But I did, there's a lot of addiction in my family. And so that really drove me to seek out, graduate training in addiction research. I was really interested in the effects of drugs on memory and attention and cognition. So sort of did that straight route. I didn't want to stop. I was afraid, if I stopped, I would never complete it. So I did Wake Forest for my master's, really focused on nicotine and cognition there, like nicotine as a cognitive enhancer, and then transferred to my PhD program. I'm happy to talk more about that. My PhD program was in Richmond at Virginia Commonwealth University. And that's when I really started to do really controlled studies, and we'll talk about that with causation, of people who smoke in laboratory settings. We're giving them different doses of nicotine and seeing if that dulls their desire to smoke, as you might imagine with nicotine replacement. I got my PhD in 2007. So it was right before e-cigarettes were right. So my whole training was really looking at nicotine as in the best light, I would say. And there's been, as you all know, a huge cultural shift around that, where nicotine has been vilified way more than when I got my training, which is an interesting sort of difference. But yeah, so really quick, I went on, I did those postdocs you mentioned. I was hyper focused on a bunch of different drugs then. I was here at Hopkins, I'm in Baltimore. I looked at ketamine, and this is separate from nicotine, alcohol, just really trying to understand different ways drugs impact cognition. And then really got disillusioned with academia. Just felt like I was so removed from the reality of where drugs are being used. Baltimore has historically, it's on the sort of the track of the drug trade. So we've always had, issues with opioids and cocaine, of course, tobacco use. So I jumped into science writing and doing systematic reviews. I left the area of nicotine and tobacco because honestly, I was really just not inspired by Society of Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, the main conference I'd go to, and just felt I got to do more. So I did that, and I was doing that. I'm writing a lot. You all can look at my CV or my my LinkedIn. But around 2014, Penny Associates, which is a consulting firm that you all may have heard of in this space, at that time they were working with Enjoy, and they knew me because my background, I was friendly with them, and they recruited me to come on board. And, you know, Joe Gitchell, who heads up Penny, and I really, you know, we still have a great relationship, but, you know, he sort of schooled me. I already knew about harm reduction, but the challenges with tobacco harm reduction. And while I was there, they signed a contract with RJ Reynolds for non-combustible products support. That's when things really hit the fan for me as a scientist, because as you all might imagine, working with a tobacco company, even in like THR, it was not received well. So people publicly removed themselves from committees with me at SRNT. I wrote, and I'll talk about this today if we can fit it into the context of a conversation, a critique of the 2016 Surgeon General's report, published that in Nicotine and Tobacco Research. And Brian King's response, he was the main author at that time of that report, and I can talk why I critiqued it, was the first sentence was just calling out my affiliation with industry. And the whole other response just doubled down on the accuracy of that report, which I believe is really biased and gets into correlation and not causation. So fast forward now, I stepped away from Penny just because I thought I gotta clean my CV, I gotta clean my disclosures. And so for the past few years, I've been rebuilding. I've been working more with CASAA, really trying to get more involved with people who use drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and a little more of my view. Right. It should have started with that, but it doesn't. And there's work to be done. I created my own company called BAK and Associates. It's basically just like me. I have no associates, and I do like science writing. I try to write for the public. I still love doing research. I'm really interested in older adults and tobacco use, how they're honestly an overlooked population. And I just signed, I promise I'll stop talking about myself, a contract to start at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in their division on addiction research and treatment. So basically I'll have my company, I'll have that affiliation. I really hope that will give me a platform to do more work with CASAA, with people, you know, Urban Survivors Union is a whole other advocacy organization for people who may be using opioids, right, or other drugs or tobacco, most commonly tobacco. But yeah, so that's where I'm at today. I'm glad to join you all. I will say my background, and we can dig into causation, correlation, all that. It's training and research methods that are really focused on very controlled lab like situations. So think randomized controlled trials. So this is like where we're very closely manipulating, say, the presence of nicotine, so we can get as close as possible. It's never fully possible to look at causation. And what I'm doing more of now, because it's essential, is more of these observational studies, naturalistic studies where you're collecting data, right? And those are a lot of the correlation studies where it's much harder to talk about causation. But in reality, I feel those can be more real world, which can be honestly more helpful than these very contrived, controlled studies, which I advocate for, but I think having both is essential.
Right.
Yeah. My only question is, do you have any pets? I know that's a weird question.
Oh, okay. Well, you might get me really emotional. So I don't currently. I had a cat. He was very mean. His name's Ashmont, but he was my best friend, and he lived to 15. Cancer got him. But I will admit, like, there's a lot of pictures of him around, so I think I still can say I have a pet.
I was going to say, 'cause if you had pets, that could be the and associates.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
You said you didn't
That's
have any associates.
beautiful.
I have two
Ashmont's
furry associates. So
there.
Hey, I always said CASAA, fake it till you make it. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of people thought we were a lot bigger than we were way back in the day in 2010, 2011, just because, you know, and Danielle makes us look way bigger. She with all of her graphics and stuff.
I love it.
We look all slick, but
I'm going to put this banner up just so everybody is aware. It is true. We are grassroots AF. That's a very real thing. But yeah, wow. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about drugs, but that's not what we're here for today. So I'm going to let Kristen, who set up our kind of show notes and all of this today. Thank you so much, Kristen, for getting everything around, because I was just a bum out shoveling snow all weekend. So I'm gonna give the floor over to Kristen, and I'm sure along the way I'm gonna have plenty of questions and things like that to throw into this conversation. So
and you know, this is a very loosely organized thing, so we're just going to kind of wing it. But I thought that one of the things we could start off with was sort of covering the definitions as far as they go in science. And correlation was one of them. But before I ask you about it, I wanted to share this with people. This is a really great website that just kind of shows you the problem with correlation and how it can be kind of manipulated. There's a whole bunch of them on here. We've got U.S. spending on science, space, and technology, how it correlates with suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. Wow, look at, they must be related. But they're not, obviously one's not causing the other. Films Nicolas Cage appeared in versus the number of people who drown by falling into a pool.
That's quality science right there.
Per capita cheese consumption versus the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. So
this only happens if you eat cheese in bed, though, right?
I have no idea, but I will share the link to that because that is kind of the gist of correlation in a lot of ways. Wouldn't you say, Annie? I mean, how would you define correlation as far as it goes with vape studies? Right. Or if you want to go right into correlation versus causation, we can do that too. But I'm thinking starting about what correlation means and how it appears in a lot of these vape studies.
Yeah. So, I mean, basic way I view it is just a relationship between two or more variables. So we as humans, in the way our brains work, we're constantly doing this, like our executive function. If we don't do that, we start facing challenges, right? With like getting through our life and day to day, because, if X, then Y. But then different from causation, we don't have to dig right in there, in that causation is where you are seeing one variable sort of predicting or the result of another variable. So you really have directionality, whereas correlation is just saying it could be bidirectional, there could be a multitude of variables impacting it. The way causation is able to be targeted is controlling all these other potential variables. So in all those examples you showed, there's a slew, right, of other variables that are impacting those relationships. And of course,
right.
Humans, our brain is designed to try to make sense of the world in that way. We're really not accurate a lot of the time. We can often think that there is a cause and not be taking into account all the variables because it is very complex.
We very much look for patterns and things. That's why you see superstitions are a perfect, example of correlation, or even the old nursery rhyme or whatever you want to call it of step on a crack, break your mother's back. There's no correlation, there's nothing supporting that. But people, you hear about like baseball players who like wear the shorts of the opposing team before every big game because at one point they did that and they won, and now there's this correlation. But clearly wearing shorts of the opposing team is not going to cause you to win the game, and there's a whole lot of other factors for winning the game. And then for causation, what does it take to get how do they get from correlation to causation? Is that a good way to put it, maybe?
Yeah. So I will say, when you have the ability to control the variables, so what this could look like is you bring someone into the lab, you make sure they haven't eaten for the 12 hours before, you make sure they haven't smoked, you use a CO monitor, you control the lighting, you control the people they're exposed to, right? Then you put a nicotine patch on their back. They don't know the dose. You're controlling their awareness of what, I'm talking more about my dissertation research. And then you have them smoke a cigarette 2 hours after that. They don't know what that cigarette is, what is in it. We gave people cigarettes with nicotine and without. So then we'd look at, how does withdrawal respond to this? That's a really good way to start pinpointing, what's the role of nicotine versus the cues when you are suppressing withdrawal. And as we know, they're very closely related, but when you start manipulating in very controlled settings, you can get closest to causation. But as a scientist, you should always, and this is a problem often in the nicotine tobacco field, among others, you should always think of this as, this is our best approximation of causation at this time, if you can talk about it. And you should be cautious saying causal. And so I think the perfect example with that versus correlation is the 1964 Surgeon General's report. So in that report, they say, or they make the the conclusion that had been made before, but they made it on a public level. Smoking causes lung cancer. They say that, lung cancer. Now, there was a lot of correlational data that brought them to that answer, a lot of population level data, right? But in combination across different levels of evidence, animal research, which was way more controlled, years of population and biological plausibility, they felt confident, which I think was appropriate, to say cause. So it doesn't require that really heavy manipulation that I did, say, in a dissertation study to get to causality, but you certainly have a higher burden on you if you're only looking at studies that say, I walk out my door at Baltimore, I start counting how many people are vaping outside bars, and then I also collect a random other variable and connect those. There, that's a way less controlled, there's so much interference.
Right.
So
Because
I don't
by
know if I'm going.
happenstance, everybody who vapes in town could have been at the bar that day. And
Right.
now you have this kind of false
Yeah.
view of that doesn't necessarily extrapolate across population. You just observing a bunch of people at a bar.
And I suppose you could use correlation studies that have shown some correlation, but then you have to show the correlation between the A and B, and then between A and D and A and C and E and F, and get all those possible variables accounted for, which a lot of times is what on a lot of vape studies you see listed if you scroll down under limitations,
Right.
because they're a cross-sectional study, or they're not clinical, they're only following people for a certain time period, and there's just so many other things. We see that a lot with the gateway studies, and there's some other stuff too that we'll get into in a minute, because I got some example ones, plus I wanted you to talk about your 2016 Surgeon General thing. The last one I kind of wanted to cover before we got into the studies, because I think the other two definitions we can bring up as we're talking about them. But could you explain what reverse causality is? Because as I was looking at these studies, I know what it is, but I had to look it up and figure out exactly what it was, because I came across this a lot. A lot of it, again, was the heart attack study.
Mm-hmm.
That reverse causality got mentioned a lot. Dr. Michael Siegel and et al. Did a rebuttal to Stanton Glance's heart attack study, and reverse causality came up a lot, and they kept saying, no, we accounted for that. And I was like, what makes it reverse? I don't understand. So do you think you could explain that in a simple way that folks could understand?
Yeah. And I find this one confusing too. So hopefully I don't botch it, but sort of reviewing my notes on it, because these are like, in a basic behavioral statistics class, like you sort of get some insight, although it's so confusing. But it's when an event is a consequence, not a cause of something. And so I do think the heart attack or cardiovascular thing also, like people, like an example, I found a study where it's, people who use e-cigarettes are more likely to have cancer. But it's suggesting that using e-cigarettes causes cancer, but it is actually more likely, and Clive Bates went into this with one of the studies, that perhaps there's a diagnosis of cancer that makes you stop smoking, or maybe your health is you've smoked for 40, 50 years, you switch to e-cigarettes as a harm reduction tool. Now it's correlated with this cancer outcome. But the main cause, right, was the 40 to 50 years of combustible tobacco use. So it's getting the directionality switched, which I think Glance, my take, and, I have a whole other one on him, and him suggesting e-cigarettes actually reduce the likelihood of smoking cessation. And it was a meta-analysis, Calcorin and Glance. This is what I do, systematic reviews. And he'd sort of done the same thing. He'd used a lot of observational studies, and often it was people highly dependent, right, on smoking, because they'd done it for so long, trying to switch to e-cigarettes. And these were, products that were different many years ago, so maybe not delivering as much nicotine. And he was just saying, oh, that means causation. But it was actually, they were highly dependent, which makes quitting smoking hard. So hopefully I'm not getting us confused, but I do think it's a big part of the misinformation coming out.
Yeah, that was my understanding of it too, that they skipped that reverse causality, that it's a chicken or the egg thing is what it is. And they're deciding what's the chicken and what came first, instead of and ignoring some of those other causes. You see that with the gateway thing too, as far as youth who, you've got, and that was, well, I may as well bring it up. That was this one, which is common liability, and which are shared risk factors. So they'll say, well, 3 times more likely to smoke if they vape, and they insinuate that that's because vaping caused them to smoke. And I do have a study here that when we get to it, we'll do that after your SGR one. But they say, oh, we accounted for these different society factors and reasons why they would smoke otherwise, and it still turns out that even if that people who would have never smoked are more likely to vape and then smoke, which there's a couple reasons that makes no sense. They argue that flavors are why kids want to vape, and then they say, well, they're going to go away from bubblegum flavor to cigarettes, which makes no sense. But exactly, they skip over that a lot of the people who would have otherwise been smoking have chosen vaping instead, because they don't misunderstand that it's safer. They understand that it's safer. So, and common liability. So that's what that means, is that somebody who's already going to smoke is likely, it has higher risk-taking behaviors, and will, if they're going to try vaping, they might also drive fast. They might also try alcohol. They may also, try to ski off the top of their roof with a sled or something. They're a risk-taking type person. And they also have other factors like, do their parents smoke? Does their friends smoke? Those are all risk factors that, they already know that, what is it, like 2 times more likely to smoke, if not more, if your parents smoke. You never see them talking about that or asking about much of that in like the surveys and stuff. And that seems to be a no-brainer. But I guess what we can do is go into, if you want to share your screen, we could go into the study that you did that kind of covers. Whoops, I still have that on there. Hold on, let me get.
Let's see if we can make it work. I may not be able to make it work, and I don't have anything fancy, so that's cool if I can't.
It's okay.
That's okay. We're never fancy here.
Links to
yeah, that's fancy good. Is not what we do best.
Cool. I'm not very fancy. Let's see if this works. So let's see if can you all see it? I see it at the bottom of my screen, but I'm having trouble getting up. It's honestly just I can just, oh wait, can you see it now?
I just brought it up for you.
Oh, all right. Let me see if I can make this presentable.
Yeah, maybe you don't have the button to physically add it to the stream or not, but
oh, that's weird.
Yeah, it's all yours now. Whenever you want me to take it down, just let me know.
Cool. Okay, actually, this was that Calcord and Glance thing. Oh wait, of course I did that. Hold on. Yeah. So sorry, these slides are so basic. I just put them together today. But to give everybody a snapshot, I already mentioned the 1964 report. I'm going to contrast that with the 2016 report that focused on youth and young adults and e-cigarettes. So the 64 report was the first one. It cited a lot. If you look at the way they reviewed evidence, and I mentioned how they had to combine a lot of data, they were very, very cautious. They actually had people associated with the tobacco companies, they were reviewing evidence too and providing feedback. It was a much more open dialogue than because you do want to get input from all. It doesn't mean you need private sector industry on the committee, but you need diverse viewpoints. That's when they mentioned causation of lung cancer. They were very cautious to say for other health conditions that later they tied more to smoking. It was correlation. So it's sort of a good example of using that caution. And they were very cautious around nicotine as an addictive substance, which of course later in the 80s became, a bigger topic. So my thing, and I'm happy to share this with anyone that's interested. I started reading this 2016 report, and this is as a person that had just lost her dad, who was 63, had smoked for 40 years. He died in his sleep likely of a heart attack. It was he had a vape device, but he hadn't quit. So I was very sensitive to the other end of the population. So I was reading it with that in mind and my history of doing systematic reviews. And the first thing I noticed is if you look at the beginning of the report, and I promise this relates to causation, They say selected studies from 2016 have been added during the review process that provide further support for the conclusions in this report. This is a damning statement of bias, confirmation bias. And this is a key part of how correlation, reverse causation, all these honestly errors in connecting variables can happen, because this is saying we only added evidence when it provided support for conclusions they'd already made. That is biased. And often we do that intellectually. So say another person had been reading this report. They were a mom of an adolescent. They had never smoked in their life or used nicotine. They didn't have any family members that had used nicotine. And they're reading this report, and their bias may be to read it and think, nicotine's harmful. No one uses it anymore. No one smokes. I've had people ask me that. Who smokes anymore? I'm like, a lot of people. And so what I'm trying to say is this report tried to integrate evidence. They used it on the name and on the record of previous Surgeon General's report, but it was very biased. It was a very rushed report. And I believe that report contributed to a lot of the policy, the push. There's still like what the website for it still has all this information about nicotine damaging the brain. And that's really where I went at it. It was missing a lot of high quality evidence. So the evidence they integrated was often correlational. It wasn't a lot of controlled studies, which can really get rid of some of these extra variables. And with nicotine in the brain, which is what I had studied all these years, one, they didn't cite a meta-analysis I had published on nicotine's effects as a cognitive enhancer. That's Heichman and colleagues. I'm the second one on that. And why wouldn't you cite that? And they really made strong conclusions about nicotine harming attention. And this is really played out largely. Yet all the evidence they cited, they had 12 studies in this section that I profiled. 4 were looking at smoking among adolescents. Well, you can't talk about nicotine's effects alone if you're looking at smoking. There's 4,000 other substances and a lot of rodent studies, which is fine. Those can be highly controlled, but often the dosing of nicotine that occurs in those studies is much higher. You're looking at cognition in rodents, which is really hard to translate to adults. So I think why this one stood out to me and why I still feel angry about it, I published this in 2018, so it's 5 years, is that, people, I felt they were so biased that they weren't able to look at causation and discuss it accurately. Not only was this in the evidence integration I mentioned here, when I challenged Brian King at SRNT in 2017, I stood up, my knees were I was shaking so much because, a person in power, but who am I? And I said, it doesn't make sense. You don't have these studies that show that nicotine alone, actually is more beneficial to a pregnant woman's fetus than smoking. That's a study out of the UK, a controlled trial. And his saying then was like, well, I didn't fully write this report. It was contractors. He was very defensive. And then when they responded to me, of course, they shot down my views because I was affiliated with Penny Associates, which was affiliated with Reynolds. But I think it gets at causation, correlation, and how this is really plaguing the truth we know. And we have known before vaporized nicotine came on the market, the nicotine is such a different beast than when you combine it with other components and with smoking. And feel free to take off my slides now. Hopefully I didn't get too off on that.
I was gonna note really quick a few things. If you wanted to make that kind of full screen again here, you mentioned confirmation bias, and so for people out there that may not understand that, that's where you have this kind of predetermined idea or notion, and what you're looking for is evidence that supports that, not the evidence across the board, not what all of the evidence is pointing to, but very specific cherry picking, if you will, for studies, whether or not they're quality studies that reaffirm your idea or whatever it is that you have in mind. And I was just going to say that this is literally the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what that is. It's saying, we already believe this is the cause here. We're going to find whatever we can, those selected studies to support that. And you're right, that is that's a massive red flag. Like, you can't lay it out any clearer that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Wild.
and I will say confirmation bias is a natural bias of the human brain. It really helps us to function, because if we thought and had detailed intellectual conversations like this all the time to try to piece out causation, we would be exhausted. So we've got to have these heuristics, these shortcuts. So it's confirmation bias can be insidious because it's really hard to see in yourself. And I'll use a personal example. Had multiple bad relationships, didn't trust men. And so when I meet my boyfriend, who I've been with several years now, I'm constantly on the lookout for anything he would do that would repeat those bad things in the past. And I wasn't aware of how much that can sabotage your, honestly, reality, because it's a confirmation bias. And you do that, right? Like, your brain can do it. And you have to deconstruct that. You have to do a lot of conscious awareness of the bias, do a lot of self-reflection, a lot of humility, because you've got to question your own thoughts. And I would say that academic medicine is not a place that really facilitates humility. And often when you get these people in power, right, the head of CCP, the head of a Surgeon General's report, maybe humility isn't something that they've had to practice a lot, but I would say it's key for removing confirmation bias. But I also don't want to sit up here and act like I am great at this. I'm certain that I do confirmation bias with harm reduction evidence and can get a little over the top with, like, everywhere I see it, this is a harm reduction. And so I have to watch myself. But yes, it's a key part of this report, which I think 2016 report is very symbolic of how the conversation and the bias has gone around this whole topic of vaping.
You're right. And it's absolutely not just in science, it's in our everyday lives. And we put those blinders on. When we get an idea in our head, we put the blinders on and we only focus on the things that reaffirm what we have going on in our head, as opposed to looking at the broader picture, looking at the big picture, taking everything in, which is what good science should do, right?
Yep.
Well, it's just like how
I can take this down if you wanted me to now.
Yeah.
But it was like I was saying before, of how they choose to view the chicken or the egg coming first. Their confirmation biases really comes into play there, because they choose to believe that it's the vaping causing the issue, and ignore or cherry pick. There's another term that comes up. Yep. I think Logan just said that too. And there's a couple studies on here that you can see where they do that. But the confirmation bias is definitely something that you see all the time. And I see kids vaping everywhere, and and then as soon as they see one, it's like, well, it is everywhere. That kids do that, teenagers do that, everybody does it, Mom. Everybody's going to the party, Mom. It's just like, no, it's not everybody. Exactly. But so I think what I was going to do is start with let's see here. This was, speaking of some stuff here, which part of my screen do I have on here? This one, I don't know if you have. Okay, I'm trying to bring it up so I can see it too. Okay, so there was a couple with linking e-cigarettes with adolescents and young adults then going on to smoking. And one of them that I came across here was this one, I think was this was the one from 2017. So this was from before the real peak in 2019. And it was really interesting because where did it come up? Systematic review, meta-analysis showed strong and consistent evidence of an association between initial e-cigarette use and subsequent smoking initiation, as well as past 30-day. And I think with this one, it was a meta-analysis, and it had these, can't say it, longitudinal
There you go.
studies. And here's the odds ratio among baseline and never smokers, cigarette smoking initiation between baseline and follow-up. And really with this one, it was I'm trying to remember because I don't have my notes up with me. So they say that they adjusted for known demographic, psychosocial and behavioral risk factors for cigarette smoking, and pooled the odds ratio for subsequent cigarette smoking initiation, which was huge versus never users. So they said e-cigarette use was associated with greater risk for smoking, and strong e-cigarette regulation could potentially curb use among youth and possibly limit future population level burden of smoking. So this was from 2017, and we know now what happened. Vaping went up and smoking went down, and there really was no gateway. I mean, you can see what happened between 2012 and 2022, and there's just no evidence for that. Yet they came up with all this risk, and other numbers added up. So I don't know if they didn't account for other factors, again, like risk-taking behaviors, whether or not the parents smoked. And I don't even think they looked at whether or not their friends smoked or whatnot. But that was one of the things that was seemed to me a correlation, but I wasn't sure how to get around the whole thing about it being that they accounted for those social things. And I don't know if these longitudinal studies are better than cross-sectional. Are they that much different, would you say? I mean, how would you interpret this if you were us?
Yeah, so longitudinal are considered a higher quality of evidence in that, because you are controlling for time, hopefully, although there can be flaws. But I think I remember this study, and I apologize, I definitely did a deep dive when it happened. I think there was a whole issue with how the common liability issue, like how they controlled for other variables. And that's a big thing. These type of studies, you're doing a lot of modeling. You're taking in variables best you can collect them. But if you're not able to collect those variables that might be explaining the association and would reduce that effect size, because you have, like, if you think of like behavior, like here's your circle of why a behavior happens. So gateway. But there's all, like, if you piece apart like a Venn diagram, there's all these other explanations for that behavior. And my understanding is, like, they were criticized heavily for how they sort of accounted for potential confounding variables or other variables that could explain it. In particular, right?
To account for.
Yeah. So, like, I believe on again, I haven't looked at it recently, is definitely a flawed analysis. Now, we thought that then. Now it's so bizarre, right? It doesn't match the real world. So it does add some evidence that whatever they were measuring wasn't fully accounted for in the model.
I mean, they were trying to say that the hand-to-mouth thing was going to make kids want to smoke, and inhaling pleasurable flavors may provide. Where did that go? I just had it. In addition, inhaling pleasurable
flavor
flavors
one is the one that
provide
really
a positive sensory experience, and then they're going to want to smoke like there's anything. That's why I always laugh when they say menthol hides the harsh taste of smoke in vapor products. It's like, what? It's like, you guys have
there's no taste of smoke in vapor products to begin with.
But one of the things that I wanted to point out,
me, I guess, I always think maybe there's something to things like sensory input when we're talking about smoking and vaping, which is one of the major reasons why vaping works so well for people who smoke, is all those sensory needs, hand to mouth, olfactory, visual stimuli, the whole nine. But the flavor one is what really always gets me. Say you have a young person who vapes, and their favorite flavor is strawberry bubblegum, and they switch to smoking because ash tastes so much better. That strawberry bubblegum led them down the road to burning ash.
And if you look at this, they're insisting.
Maybe there's one or two out there, but it's just, as somebody who used to smoke and now vapes, it's just one of those things, I think, where personal experience comes into play, and you just go, I just don't buy it.
I mean, and somebody who was in the very earliest days of vaping, well, not the very earliest, but very early days in 2009, I remember when people were chasing that ash taste. They were trying to figure out, how can I make this not taste so sweet? How can I, make it taste more like smoking? And then they pretty much just got used to not having it. But I mean, I just find it funny that they're insisting that they even talk about it here about how you should basically ban flavors and restrict the advertising and stuff like that, while arguing that they're going to go on to smoke because of the flavors. It just makes no sense. But one of the things that I usually do is I'll scroll down to the bottom and try to see if I can find the limitations, which I didn't find here. But I do agree with you. I do believe that was one of those cases. Another one that actually came out more recently this past November was called The Impact of the E-Cigarette Era on Cigarette Smoking Among Youth in the United States, a population level study. And this one we actually just tweeted about recently, and a rebuttal that somebody had published to this, making a few points. And that was on Clive's list too. But this one really was, to me, an example of cherry picking. Because if you look at it, they chose, they said among all students past 30 days smoking declined 0.75% per year from 2002 to 2013, and then following a significant drop in prevalence from 2013 to 2014, which they don't try to explain. The decline in the past 30-day cigarette smoking slowed significantly to approximately only 0.37% per year from 2015 to 2019. We estimate that the onset of the e-cigarette era in 2014 corresponded to 1.66 million, more than the past day cigarette smokers from 2015 to 2019. So the irony of this one is, because after I read this, I went and I did a chart, because I thought, well, why did they start with 2014? First of all, I've been vaping since 2009. 2012 is when they first started recording it in the surveys, in the CDC surveys. And why didn't they go back to that? And not only that, the whole different time period, from say 2002 to 2012, and then you're skipping 2 years and then going 2014 to 2019. And what I did is I went back and I charted that just from 2002, 2012 to 2022, nice 10-year spans there. And it came out like this. And then I put the trend line in there. If you're going to follow where that blue line, that blue arrow was going to go, if it just continue. I know this is not like scientific, but it does show the trend line of the direction it was going, and this weird veer off in 2012, the first year when they started tracking all this. And the kids had been started vaping really a year or two before that. They only started tracking it in 2012. It just starts veering down. And if that trend line had followed, we'd be above 5% now, not at 2%. And the thing is that in 2014, the rate had gone down already to, I want to believe, 8.8% or something. I'd have to pull it back up again, but it was already the Healthy People 2020 goal for adolescent cigarette smoking was 16% for 2020. And by 2014, it was already down to like 8% or something like that. And so now you're looking at dropping from 22.9% in 2002 all the way down to 14%, which, okay, that's a good drop. But in 2012, it dropped from 14 to 2%. And you can't, what happened? It wasn't Tobacco 21. That didn't happen until 2019. But it seems like they cherry picked, and it just kind of randomly like, oh, there was a big drop in 2013 to 2014, but don't look at that. We're talking about dropping, how fast it started dropping from now 8% or whatever it was to 2%. So of course it's going to be slower. You're getting to those super low numbers where fewer and fewer, you're going to have more inveterate people who are pretty much embedded in smoking and are not going to quit. You're getting down to the diehards there, like me, who said I was never going to quit because I ended up switching to vaping, but I thought I was going to die smoking. So there's going to be a specific segment of the population that's going to be like that. So as you get closer and closer to zero, it's going to get slower and slower, don't you think? So do you think that they cherry picked, as we talked about before there, that starting at 2014 instead of 2012, and because what is that from 14 to 22? That's a 8.9 percentage point drop, and then a 12 percentage point drop between 2012 and 2022. But they chose 2014, so it's a smaller drop because there was that huge drop between 2012 and 2014 that just kind of.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
I think I haven't read the article. I did see that Flo had done that critique, which is great. I bet that they had to address that in their thing, like why they chose 2014. If they don't, that would be a glaring, insight into that. My other hunch is like Flo's critique probably gets at things they did not control for in their analysis, and like they're draw. So I think it gets at your correlation causation thing. Does Flo in this critique, does he have like a bottom line?
Well, yeah, I love his bottom line. It says, in conclusion, the analysis by Harrell et al. Is flawed and does not provide convincing evidence for the existence of a gateway effect at population level. But he brought up does not fully discuss the competing population level trend literature. So all the stuff out there that says it's not leading to smoking, basically, that's what that's saying, right? Excludes the National Youth Tobacco Survey data prior to 2002. I didn't know if that was as important, but I think that them skipping over what happened in 2012, because they just randomly chose 2014 as being the beginning of the e-cigarette era, which it wasn't, dude. It's kind of in the middle of the e-cigarette era. Fits a discontinuous piecewise model that interrupted time.
Do you think a lot of people consider that the beginning of the e-cigarette era just because we associate it so much with Juul?
They didn't come out till 2015, though.
Didn't Juul release initially in 2014, late 2014?
I don't so. I want to say
2015?
I want to say 2015.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I get that idea a lot when people talk about this e-cigarette era, and we talk about that kind of 2014, 2015 time. And I think a lot of people just associate it completely and utterly with Juul. And we forget the thousands of other vapor products that came before the Juul was ever in existence.
Right.
But yeah, that's right around the time of.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what they do. And he says here, it says it uses 2014 as the cutoff year to distinguish between the e-cigarette era and before. This year coincides with the change in this questionnaire wording that's known to produce systematically higher e-cigarette prevalence estimates. For one, e-cigarettes were not introduced in 2014, but circa 2006, 2007. And 2006 is identified as the knee of the data by an alternative. I didn't understand that. What's the knee? I don't know if you understand that. E-cigarette use in the survey increased by over 170% from 2011 to 2013, the impact of which is discounted by using 2014 as a cutoff. So, yeah, that's one of those situations where they were cherry picking. So that's a little bit different from the correlation versus causation thing. But again, for them to come out and say that this data proves, where do they put that in their conclusion? Essentially, they say the rate of decline in the past 30-day cigarette smoking prevalence among adolescents observed since 2002 slowed with the onset of the e-cigarette era in 2014, providing evidence at a population level for the gateway effect. So, I mean, they're insinuating that more youth started smoking than otherwise would have had vaping not existed. But I don't know where they get that from. I mean, it's so clear that it took a nosedive. Smoking took even if you don't follow that trend line, it's so clear that in 2012, it just took a nosedive. And between 2012 and 2022, it dropped much faster than it was between 2002 and 2012. But they chose to start in 2014, which if you look at those numbers then, there's not as big of a drop because it only went from 8% to 2% instead of 14% to 2% in the full 10-year span, So I thought that was an interesting one.
I did just do a little Google foo over here. I was wrong. It was the summer of 2015 that Juul officially released in the US. So a year prior to that is when they're going back to, which also to me, just instinctively, just because, we hear so much about the e-cigarette era being in that time, it's like, so they knew Juul released in 2015. So let's just compensate. We'll just go 1 year back. We don't need anything from before that.
Right.
You know,
Well, because that
that
made the
should be
numbers look
sufficient
better.
enough to look at pre-Juul era, you know.
That was cherry picking. They're making the numbers look better. And I'm going to put all these links into the description. But this one is a really interesting one because they just looked at all of this stuff, including the one that I just showed, or no, the two before, the first earlier one, because this was from 2020. They actually looked at that 2017 one and said the relationship between e-cigarette use and conventional cigarette smoking is largely attributed to shared risk factors. And that's where we're looking back again at that shared risk factors. You know, the why am I blanking on what the other thing it's called? But so this was a good one too that they did that with. So another one that you see a lot of, and this is kind of right in your wheelhouse, is the depression and anxiety symptoms are linked to vaping nicotine and THC in teens and young adults. And this is where you like to see in the news, where you like to see, where you will often see in the news. And for a lot of these, and that was what really got me, is the media often reports these things as showing causation. You know, e-cigarettes may cause heart attacks. E-cigarettes may cause worse lung damage than you know. They put that little may in there, but the big things that people see are e-cigarettes worse than smoking. And there is an abstract for this one, but in this one they said a study of more than 2,500 people ages 13 to 24 found that nicotine-only vapors, THC-only vapors, and dual vapors were more likely to report anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, and suicidal thoughts when compared with their peers who did not use electronic cigarettes. Now, if you stop there, which most people will read the headline and maybe a couple lines if they get that far, you would be led to think that it's that vaping that's causing the symptoms. I mean, you probably see that all the time, right? So, and then even the quotes that, you know, younger people have long been vulnerable to tobacco use, may experience greater harm from nicotine and other drugs, and may be targeted by tobacco advertisers and marketers. Again, it's making it seem like they're targeted and they're going to be damaged more, and it's causing this anxiety and this stress.
Brainworms.
I don't know if you had a chance to look at this one or not.
No, but I think more broadly, I mean, we're seeing national trends of mental health conditions among younger populations, right? So increases in depression, increases anxiety. There's like stepping away from nicotine. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's awareness. So teens are maybe more likely to predict or report it, but there's also, you know, there's situational things. Then you're trying to connect that. So you've got this growing number with depression or anxiety in general to another trend, which is a larger number, not that many, honestly, of teens using nicotine through vaping and all that. And then you're connecting it. And did they control for those common liabilities? Did they control for growing up in a home that had traumatic experiences? That trauma directly predicts both substance use, including nicotine, tobacco, and it predicts depression and anxiety. So there you get that additional variable. I mean, that's one of many.
Sure. And this kind of goes back to like what you were just talking about. You have these two separate trends that we're trying to piece together. That kind of that first, those slides, or that first site that Kristen showed us, U.S. spending on science and space, you know, correlating to suicides by hanging. So you have these two very similar trends that are happening at the same time, which may or may not have an actual, you know, causational link there. We're really trying to make one.
And this is a good example of reverse causality, you know, of do teens vape and then get depressed and anxious, or are depressed and anxious kids more likely to vape? And to me, I think it's really it's a no-brainer, because you look at a lot of populations and communities where stressors are higher, mental health is higher, lack of help for mental health is a problem. So you look at low income populations, you look at minority populations, you look at LGBTQ plus populations, teenagers in general, people who are suffering from mental health issues. I don't know a single person in real life who either smokes or vapes who doesn't have some kind of mental health concern. I don't want to say issue, but there's, stress, anxiety. There are people who do things like they bite their nails, or they twirl their hair, or they may do other drugs as well, or very anxious, OCD. I don't necessarily mean this as people who are psychotic or have very severe problems, which those people also are known to do that, because in my opinion they're self-medicating. I don't need an antidepressant, you know what I mean, because nicotine is working just fine for me. So I definitely don't believe those problems came from, I mean, I have a family history. My mom didn't smoke, and she has a family history of, she had clinical depression, and took medications for it that messed her up big time. She was on, what was that one that back in the 80s or 90s that was causing suicidal thoughts and stuff like that? She was on that, and she had a really bad reaction with that. So yeah, I that's one of those things of the chicken and the egg sort of thing, where they're taking these associations and saying it's causing it. And like what this guy says, the products were developed as smoking cessation tools for those that use traditional cigarettes. So I'm very curious now what the implications are with mental health and users who are using these products to help stop smoking. I mean, strongly implying that when you're trying to quit smoking and you're going to switch to vaping, that it's going to give you a mental health issue.
Yeah. Well, another question, did they look at smoking in this, or did they only look at vaporized THC and nicotine? Like, where is the relative risk? Because if they didn't look at smoking, why is he even talking about it? And also, that's a flawed study. I heard a scientist say recently, I'm sorry, and I know we're at time, but like, no, we need to stop comparing vaping to smoking. It is no longer. And I'm like, that is insane. Like, why would you do? Because like, right. And it also, this is how causality is taken into account. Also, add in some other things teens use: premarital sex or unprotected sex or whatever teens are doing, like all the crazy things we did, whippets, other drugs. Are you taking that into account, or is it just this strange 2,000 people that only vaped, which honestly are probably from a higher socioeconomic status, because vaping correlates, or it has historically, with young people that are white and from higher class. So it's like, anyway, sorry, it's just irritating to see that.
Oh, no. That's good to have somebody ranting except me this time.
Yeah, and one of the things that always stood out to me is, like Kristen was talking about, socioeconomic impacts, low-income populations, things like this, are where we still see the highest smoking prevalence. And I think one of the big glaring things we often skip over is, right after that 1964 Surgeon General's report came out, we did see a massive drop in smoking in this country, but we really only saw it in the well-to-do, affluent white population in this country, people who weren't experiencing those same stress factors and those same, societal issues, found it the easiest to go, okay, I'll quit smoking. And we've kind of whittled it down from there. But that biggest drop was still essentially right after that report came out. And the population that, I guess essentially had it the easiest, found it the easiest to quit. And we've kind of whittled it down from there. But I always think that's such a big thing when we talk about, smoking population and risk factors, socioeconomic impacts, all these things. And we look at, well, who found it the easiest right out of the gate when we said smoking was bad? And it was the well-to-do, affluent, healthy white population in this country.
Yeah, they probably switched to other drugs they had access to.
Sure. Why smoke when you have cocaine?
Oh my God. That always made me crazy, because you argue with people like on Twitter or whatnot, and they always say, well, we want this, it's great that they're switching to this stuff, but then they need to get off of nicotine. They need to be absent from nicotine. That's the ultimate goal. And I'm like, well, that might be your ultimate goal, but it's not mine. And they don't want to acknowledge any of the benefits, but they're in this la land where they think everyone's going to quit nicotine and they're going to become, they're going to do meatless Mondays and exercise every day and become A students. I don't know what they think. It's like they don't think it's going to be replaced by anything. And it's like people are self-medicating. I know I am. But to me, I'd have no nails if I didn't vape. And I'd probably weigh about 500 pounds because, and I'm not, my mom, she was morbidly obese after she quit smoking. So, I mean, I just don't think they're going to, and here's a good correlation for you. This is what I was thinking of as he was talking, a good correlation, I can't prove causation, but a good correlation is since everybody started quitting smoking, we have much higher rates of suicide, much higher rates of people using antidepressants and obesity. There's a good correlation for you. It's not causation,
exactly, correlation.
but they won't look at any of that. They won't look to see if any of that's connected, because that would be showing how not having nicotine was actually a bad thing for people.
Yeah. And I will just add this because I often like subtract out from nicotine and think more broadly on addiction, because like I've looked at all these other substances. You know, right. I'm at SRNT last week, by the way, presented on older adults who smoke, which are way more likely to be low SES, less education, and non-white. No change in smoking prevalence for 20 years in the United States for people 65 and over. So that's a whole other talk I'd be willing to come back on. But I'm watching these people and, you know, in closed conversations, they act like the goal is total nicotine abstinence. If you're using an e-cigarette, we got to figure out a way for e-cigarette cessation. Yet they're at the bar drinking, or they're at the bar, you know, hooking up with someone that's not their partner. And I'm like, why are you cool with the pleasures in your life that happen to not be nicotine? You're allowed to do these things that's quote unquote are moralistically wrong. But nicotine, and to me, it's become the new, you know, when I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, it was a very Bible Belt town. We were dry county. It's the new alcohol. And I know I'm preaching in the choir, but being there, and it's sort of like, people want pleasure. Again, it's part of our brain. It doesn't mean that I need to eat everything I see, which I want to do sometimes. We clearly need harm reduction. We need ways to do this safely. But yeah, it's almost like out of touch. And honestly, it's people that I feel like in academia that have never had a family member smoke. They're the ones that say to me, who still smokes? You're out of touch. You're not in the communities. You don't come from the family that had it. Yeah. You shouldn't honestly be writing these papers. Sorry.
No, not at all. It also is, it's just so ironic when you see, because I get the Google search words every day to go for doing our blog and our social media posting. And in the same email, I'll get nicotine being studied to help improve cognitive function. And then right below it will be something saying new studies shows brain damage in teens. Yep. It's like, how is this doing both these? And they don't even, there's this disconnect, this cognitive, you know, this bias that they just can't see any benefit, because it's been, and it's so funny because like you said, way back in the day, tobacco control was arguing, trying to get people to trust NRT nicotine and to get that passed and get that out there for people so they would not expose themselves to smoke. This is safe. You can use this. Try it. We need flavors. They were arguing for flavors, for companies to be able to sell flavors, because the original flavor, like Nicorette or whatever, was awful. And they were arguing for flavors. This was tobacco control. And now they're using all these arguments against vaping, that, you know, flavors are bad, teens are going to use it, all that kind of stuff. Somehow the nicotine that's used, same nicotine that's used in e-cigarettes and our NRT, it's the same identical stuff, but the stuff in the e-cigarettes is worse. It's worse nicotine because it's higher. They ignore self-regulation, self-titration. I mean, nobody sits there. You don't see people who smoke end up smoking 50 packs a day because they lose their, they get a what do you call that, a tolerance for it, you know. But yet they seem to think that, so you can't take a 50 milligram vape and vape it as much. I mean, if I just switch from 3 to 6, it reduces how much I can vape, because like my store ran out of 3 and I had to use 6, and I'm definitely not doing it as much as I was before. So that whole leveling, self-titration, or whatever they cause it, they ignore that too. They never talk about that. I don't know if you've noticed that either.
Yeah. Human beings are very efficient at titrating our nicotine consumption.
See, I can rant too, so don't worry about it.
The only thing that I wanted to end this with, because we definitely are at time, is that, you know, I struggle to understand the abstinence only and prohibitionist mindset, just purely from a human nature and historical view. People have been consuming drugs for thousands of years. We have evidence going back on cannabis 8,000 some odd years, you know, opiates with opium and the poppy plant going back 6,000 plus years. We have evidence of the, you know, use of cocaine, and not necessarily like full cocaine, but coca in itself, thousands of years. Again, tobacco. So it's it's wild to me. Like, no matter how many dare programs you put out, or no matter how much more illegal you make something, drugs are very much a part of human nature. They are, whether you yourself uses these drugs is irrelevant. But when we look at humans, as a species, as a whole, we use drugs for a whole number of reasons, for so many reasons, for pleasure, for stimulus, for coping, for whatever it may be.
For cures.
And
Mhm.
this idea that we're going to legislate or dictate and shame people out of something that is so innate to us as humans, is just wild. It's so, I don't know if it's just egotistical, if it's brash, whatever it is that gets people in that mindset that, yes, we can eliminate this thing that
Yep.
is so fundamental to our species. It's on par. Drugs are on par with, socializing and all of these
Yeah.
other things that are so very human. It's part of us. It's part of our story. It is just astounding that people can get into that mindset and ignore all of that and just go, yeah, no, we can make this illegal and everybody will stop.
Yeah.
It's crazy that they
Yeah.
think that.
I think they put it in a box, and it's like drug use is somehow this thing to be controlled, and not seeing like the way the human brain works is we like to stimulate it. The whole basis is right, like the dopamine serotonin interaction, whether it's food, drugs, or not, that we're just manipulating chemicals. It's
Sure,
the
the
same when I was
molecules, they're
little.
not these scary boogeymen things. They're simply molecules that, our brains and bodies react to. And obviously there's so many
Yes.
things that work along with that, and how a person uses drugs, and societal factors and stressors, things like this, which can, lead to dependency and whatnot. That's a whole nother
Right.
conversation. But yeah, it is really, truly, it will always astound me, when we have this vast history that we should and could definitely should be learning from, yet we just like, that academia, like, abstinence only, this is the only way. And right now,
Yeah.
we're setting record highs for overdoses in this country, while we're
Well,
still,
yeah,
pushing
drug
for
ban.
further criminalization and all of these things. It just feels like, it just feels so backwards all the
And then in
time.
other areas like psychedelics, we're seeing the light, and the idea that
I was gonna
all
say.
those years, right? But it's not consistent. In Maryland, we're going to have access to legal cannabis this summer. And to me, it's so strange, right? And I know you all talk about this more, but like here we're banning more nicotine tobacco than we are THC.
Call
There's,
to action.
yeah. It's
What's
just,
We have a call to
astonishing
action.
too is when they bring up how failed the drug war on these other substances has been,
Yeah, it's like they don't
while
know.
simultaneously initiating a new drug war elsewhere.
Yeah,
yeah.
Because you know what?
yeah.
That one didn't work out so well. Let's try it on this. It's just,
Let's
I
do
think
it this way. This has got to work.
they see the trend going down from the 1964 report, and they can't resist keeping that going. Like it
Sure.
just, of course it'll work. And I just, yeah, I don't have the words to explain. Like there's a huge miss
There
here.
is
This
a massive
idea,
disconnect.
well, that was one of the things in the in that for the gateway thing where he said that they have this the trend line that they're going to would go to zero, which is just completely unreasonable. We know
Yeah.
that it's not going to happen, and they think that they're going again. How does banning something that whole, like I said, the cognitive dissonances of
Mhm.
we have to stop banning stuff. Bans don't work. The drug war has failed. We have to quit doing that. Ban flavors, ban e-cigs. Like, how do
Yeah.
people from the same that whole mindset, and it's crazy. And I just don't know what they think that people are going to do. And I think a big problem is they don't see any benefit. It's tobacco control has done such a good job of saying the only reason people smoke is because they're addicted to nicotine, and they don't give
Mhm.
any benefit. They don't acknowledge that there's that, like, I'm receiving any benefit from it, but I see that I do get a benefit from it. So but they won't look at the fact that I don't have to take any kind of antidepressant. Not that that's a bad thing, but I know, but those have their own side effects too. My mom suffered from them,
Right.
so they don't see any benefit. So they think that the only reason we continue to use nicotine is just because it's addictive. That's it. That's the only reason. That's why they can't see. And that's why you see them saying things like, we need to save a whole new generation. There's a whole new generation who's going to be addicted to nicotine. It's like, and there's generations, but you're fine with them drinking coffee every day. I get a headache if I don't get my coffee. That's a withdrawal symptom. Hello. So yeah, but oh my God, it's already 10:02. So we have to.
Say,
we want to hang out in the back.
We can't go down the rabbit hole of drugs on here because we'll be another 3 hours.
Right. Promise to come back. We should have another talk.
I'd love that.
Kind of go on to that.
We'll do an episode. It's just called CASAA Does Drugs, and we'll have Annie on.
That's good.
But yeah, thank you, Annie, for taking the time today to talk to us about this. I hope that this kind of maybe clarified or answered some questions from people, might have correlate some answers for folks out there in the differences and what to look out for when we're looking at different studies and what conclusions to jump to and what not to jump to. So definitely thank you very much, Annie, for joining us today. Sure. Definitely stick around, though, post broadcast so we can get all of the recordings and things. I forgot to mention that before the show. Definitely stick around for just a few more minutes.
Okay.
Kristen, do you have any, or Annie, really, do you have any wrap-up thoughts for everybody out there after all of this?
Just thank you all. I'd love to be more involved. I think there needs to be more of this engagement with researchers, not all these barriers. You all are the point that we're getting funded and doing our work. So thank you.
Yeah. Nothing about us without us.
Yep.
We'll scream it from the rooftops. Nothing about us without us. Kristen, any thoughts before I go through our spiel?
I don't think so. I talked a lot this episode, so I'll shut up now. All right, Annie, we're just gonna put you back in the staging area here and wrap things up. See you in a bit.
All right.
Thank you, everybody who's tuning in. Thank you for everybody who's here right now. Thank you for all your great comments and questions. I'm sorry we didn't pull more of them up during the broadcast like we usually do. I think Kristen and I were both just so engaged in this conversation with Annie. But thank you all for being here, and thank you to everybody watching the replay right now. I did not forget about you this time. If you are currently not a member of CASAA, you're breaking my heart right now. Head over to CASAA.org. Sign up today. It's absolutely free. We promise not to blow up your email, but we will when we absolutely have to, so that way everybody can be involved. We have a lot of calls to action out, like we went over at the top of the hour. So there's a lot going on. And really quick, just to recap that: New York, Minnesota, Nebraska, Cleveland, Ohio, Maryland, Oregon, Connecticut, New Mexico, Hawaii, and heads up in Indiana and Illinois. All of those things are available on CASAA's website, where all the calls to action are posted. You can just go over to the clicky map, click your state. If you live in a state, we've got it up on the clicky map. And by the way, if you live in a state, and territory, we also have Facebook groups, Facebook pages that you can join and be a part of, which is not only just awesome to be there, but you also get to be a little bit more involved. Maybe there's something that comes up super locally that we haven't caught onto yet. It's a great way to give us a heads up, so that way we can put that out and kind of spread the word in a bigger way there. So head over to CASAA.org. You can also donate while you're there. We definitely love donations. Thank you. And if you are so inclined to pick up some sweet merch, you can do that as well. Danielle Jones has a bunch of fantastic designs up. You get to be a walking billboard for tobacco harm reduction, and I don't think there's many things that are better than that. I think that's it. Same time, same place, 2 weeks from now.
I think so. We don't have a topic yet, but we'll see. We might be.
I'm telling you, CASAA does drugs. That's our next show. We'll bring Annie back. We're not actually going to do drugs. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, but we're definitely going to talk. No, that's not going to be the show.
Well, technically we do already, so we're all.
I mean, I could talk about drugs all day long.
I know you.
They're fascinating things. But I think that's going to do it. Yeah, amazing molecules, and they're definitely not the boogeyman society and the media likes to make them out to be. So, more truth to power and all of that.
I'm just going to say happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody.
Yes,
and
yes.
We won't see you for 2 weeks.
If you're somebody who's going to be going out to celebrate St. Patty's Day at the bars and pubs and whatnot, stay hydrated, be safe, drink responsibly, take care of yourselves and take care of those around you. That's going to do it for us. We're out of here.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.